Ever get that feeling? Like you just know something, even though you haven't actually seen it. We're diving into the possibility that maybe, just maybe, some of us can actually see without seeing through, remote viewing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area where the line between science fiction and cutting-edge research starts to blur.
Right. Psychic spies, seeing across continents. But we're grounding this deep dive in some solid data. You provided us with this incredible meta-analysis of remote viewing studies.
And a meta-analysis is perfect for this. It lets us combine findings from, tons of individual studies, so we get a much clearer picture of what's actually going on rather than just one study's results.
Like instead of relying on one person saying remote viewing totally works,
Yeah.
and another saying no, bunk science, we're looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's key because remote viewing has been, well, notoriously difficult to study. A meta-analysis helps us cut through some of that noise and see if there's a real signal there.
Okay, so what's the verdict? After crunching all those numbers, is there actual evidence for remote viewing?
Okay, so this meta-analysis looked at 36 studies on remote viewing.
Wow, that's a lot.
Right, it's a really significant sample size. And what really jumped out was that they found a statistically significant trend, a strong effect size.
Okay, time for a quick translation for those of us who don't speak fluent statistics. What does a strong effect size actually tell us, in plain English?
Basically, it means something beyond just random chance is likely going on. Now, this doesn't automatically mean everyone's psychic, but does tell us we shouldn't just dismiss remote viewing out of hand.
Interesting. So we've got this statistically significant hint that something's happening, but it doesn't necessarily mean we've proven remote viewing itself is the cause.
Exactly. We need to be both open-minded and skeptical at the same time. These findings definitely call for a closer look, though.
And this meta-analysis got even more interesting. It didn't just look at remote viewing in a vacuum. It compared it to other methods people have used to try to tap into ESP, like, Ganzfeld experiments, those sensory deprivation tanks.
Right, and they also compared it to precognitive tasks, where people try to predict future events.
So how did remote viewing stack up against those other contenders? Was it the ESP All-Star?
This is where it gets really interesting, actually. Remote viewing actually outperformed the other ESP methods they looked at.
Wow. Not only did it show a statistically significant effect, but it had even stronger results than these other, maybe better-known ESP techniques.
Right, precisely. And that alone begs the question, what is it about remote viewing that might lead to stronger ESP effects? It's a huge point for further research.
Huge is an understatement. Now, I'm dying to know, did they find out if some people are just natural-born remote viewers? Or can anyone learn this stuff? Like, do I need to sign up for, psychic spy school?
This is where the findings might surprise you. They actually didn't find a big difference in the results between people who had gone through formal remote viewing training and those who hadn't.
Wait, really? You're telling me those intense training montages in movies are a total fabrication?
Well, it's not necessarily that simple. The meta-analysis didn't find a statistically significant difference, at least with the data available. But a lot of the studies they looked at didn't really dig into the specifics of different training methods or how long people had been training.
That makes sense. Like comparing someone who took a weekend cooking class to a professional chef. Both can cook, but their skill levels are going to be wildly different.
Exactly. So while this meta-analysis gives us a broad overview, we need to dive deeper into the who of remote viewing and figure out what role, if any, training plays. It's not the whole story.
Okay, so the jury's still out on whether you need to be a remote viewing master to get results. But what about the techniques themselves? Did the researchers look at different approaches to remote viewing?
They did. The two most common techniques in the studies were controlled remote viewing and extended remote viewing.
Those sound intriguing. Can you break those down for us regular folks who aren't fluent in psychic jargon?
Of course. Controlled remote viewing, or CRV, is the more structured approach. It uses specific steps and protocols to guide the viewer. Think of it as a more analytical and methodical way of tapping into that remote information.
So less about waiting for a psychic lightning bolt to strike and more about, okay, let's follow these steps and see what comes up.
Exactly. On the other hand, extended remote viewing, or ERV, emphasizes relaxation and internal focus.
So maybe something closer to meditation.
You got it. ERV often uses techniques similar to guided meditation to help the viewer quiet their mind and access deeper levels of perception.
It's fascinating how different those sound. Like two totally different approaches to the same goal. Do we know if one works better than the other?
That's where the meta-analysis hit a bit of a roadblock. There wasn't enough data to directly compare the effectiveness of CRV versus ERV.
Another mystery. I'd love to see a study pitting them head to head. Now, one thing that's always stood out to me about remote viewing is the role of the interviewer. It's not like you're just alone in a room with your thoughts. Can you explain what the interviewer does and if the research says anything about their impact on the results?
You're right. The interviewer, sometimes called a monitor, is a unique element in a lot of remote viewing sessions. Their job isn't to tell the viewer what to see, but to guide their attention, help them describe their impressions and make sure they're staying on track. Kind of like a mental coach.
It's interesting how important guidance seems to be in this whole process. Did the researchers find a link between having an interviewer and actually having like a successful remote viewing session?
This is another one of those intriguing findings. The meta-analysis actually found that studies where there was an interviewer present tended to have better results. Now, this doesn't mean it's impossible to have a successful remote viewing experience on your own, but it does hint that having a trained guide might amplify those abilities somehow.
That makes sense, though. It's like having an experienced wilderness guide when you're navigating unfamiliar territory. Their expertise can make all the difference.
Exactly. And it highlights how important the interpersonal dynamic might be in remote viewing, which is something you don't usually see in other types of ESP research.
Okay, so to recap, we've got some statistically significant clues that there's something real happening with remote viewing. But, we're not ready to rewrite the textbooks just yet.
Right, and we've got this really intriguing finding that remote viewing actually seems to outperform other ESP techniques, at least according to this meta-analysis.
And maybe the most surprising finding of all training might not be the be-all and end-all we assumed it was, though there's a lot more to unpack on that front.
Absolutely. There are still plenty of questions to answer, like how much of a role does the interviewer play in all of this? And what about that analytical overlay thing? It sounds like that can really mess with a remote viewer's results.
Yeah, can you explain what that is for our listeners who, are just tuning in?
Basically, analytical overlay is when your mind jumps to conclusions too quickly, trying to make sense of those intuitive flashes you're getting. So you might latch onto one little detail and then try to force everything else to fit that interpretation, even if it's not accurate.
So it's like if I get a sense of water and something big and metallic, my brain might jump to cruise ship, even if it's actually like a giant metal sculpture of a fish in a fountain.
Exactly. And that tendency to jump to conclusions can really muddy the waters in remote viewing. It's something both viewers and interviewers need to be super aware of.
Kind of like that game telephone, where you whisper a phrase around a circle and it's totally different by the end.
Perfect analogy. And that's one thing that makes remote viewing different from, say, Ganzfeld experiments or dream ESP. In those techniques, it's more about just observing and reporting what comes up, not trying to analyze it on the fly.
So with remote viewing, you need more than just the ability to perceive things remotely. You also need the mental discipline to avoid letting your conscious mind get in the way.
Precisely. It's a real balancing act between opening yourself up to those subtle impressions and staying objective enough to avoid, projecting your own interpretations onto them.
That sounds tricky. No wonder those interviewers come in handy. Having someone there to help you stay on track must be invaluable.
Exactly. The interviewer isn't just there for company. They're a vital part of the process.
Okay, so if we assume for a moment that remote viewing works, even a little bit, it's not hard to imagine how it could be useful in the real world. Wasn't the CIA really into this stuff back in the day?
They definitely were. That's probably the most famous or infamous example of people trying to use remote viewing for practical purposes.
I know, it sounds like something straight out of a spy movie. But it was a real thing.
Oh, absolutely. There were actually several government-funded programs looking into the potential of using remote viewing for, intelligence gathering, the most well-known being Project Stargate. The idea was that trained remote viewers could potentially collect intel on enemy locations, activities, even their plans that would normally be impossible to access.
And in the world of espionage, where even a tiny advantage can make a huge difference, I can see why they'd be interested in anything that might give them an edge, even if it seemed a little out there.
Exactly. But whether those programs were actually successful is still up for debate. There are definitely some interesting stories, but separating fact from fiction, especially with all the secrecy surrounding those operations, is nearly impossible.
Right. You got classified information, conflicting accounts, and a whole lot of skepticism from the scientific community. It's a recipe for a mystery that'll probably never be fully solved.
And it's not just espionage either. People have explored using remote viewing in all sorts of fields archaeology, trying to find hidden artifacts, finance, even trying to predict the stock market.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. What's the main takeaway for our listener? What should they be thinking about after listening to all of this?
I think the key takeaway is this. While we can't definitively say remote viewing is 100% real based on this meta-analysis alone, the evidence is intriguing enough that we can't just ignore it. We've got these statistically significant trends suggesting something is going on, and the potential applications, if we can figure out how to harness it reliably, are mind-blowing.
It really does feel like we're just scratching the surface here. Even after decades of research, there's still so much we don't know.
Exactly. We need more rigorous research, more standardized methods, and frankly, more open-mindedness from the scientific community to really crack the code of remote viewing.
Even with my skeptical hat on, I can't help but get excited about the possibilities here. What would a world where we could use this ability at will look like? It would be revolutionary.
Absolutely. It would be a complete game changer. But until then, all we have is the research and the amazing stories of people who claim to have experienced remote viewing firsthand.
And speaking of those amazing stories, this meta-analysis didn't just focus on the hard data, did it? It also touched on the more subjective, personal experiences of remote viewers.
Yeah.
Especially how those experiences differ from other ESP phenomena.
Right. And for me, this is where things get really fascinating. It's not just about stats and probabilities anymore. It's about altered states of consciousness, the subtleties of perception, and what it actually feels like to experience remote viewing from the inside.
So, give us a glimpse into that world. What do these remote viewers say it's like? What's going on in their minds when they're allegedly tapping into this ability?
It definitely varies from person to person, but many describe it as a state of heightened awareness, almost like entering a flow state where information seems to come more effortlessly. But, and this is important, it's not like they're watching a movie playing out in their heads.
Really? So what is it like then?
They say it's not like ordinary vision at all. It's more symbolic, impressionistic. They might get fleeting images, physical sensations, strong feelings, or even just a powerful sense of knowing something about the target without any clear sensory input.
Wow, that's so different from how we usually experience the world. It's like they're accessing a whole other channel of information, one that bypasses our five senses entirely.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us back to the role of the interviewer, or monitor, who can help make sense of these often vague impressions and keep the viewer from going too far down the rabbit hole of interpretation.
It's like they need a translator for this other channel of information, someone who can speak the language of remote viewing.
Exactly. Having a trained guide to help navigate those murky waters seems to be crucial, which again sets remote viewing apart from a lot of other ESP research.
It's like the old saying, two heads are better than one, especially when one of those heads has spent years studying the art of remote viewing. Okay, so we've got this fascinating blend of subjective experiences and, attempts to measure them objectively. But what about the aspect of time? We've been talking about remote viewing in the present, but there's also this, mind-blowing possibility of viewing things in the past or even the future, right?
Absolutely. And that's where we get into some of the most mind-boggling and hotly debated territory in this whole field.
Okay, hold on. We're talking about potentially looking back into history or even like glimpsing the future using only our minds. This is some next-level stuff. But seriously, the idea of precognitive remote viewing, seeing things that haven't even happened yet, it's both incredibly cool and kind of hard to wrap my head around.
It really challenges our everyday understanding of how time works, doesn't it? And while this meta-analysis didn't focus primarily on precognitive remote viewing, there were a few studies included that, did dip their toes into those waters.
And what did they find? Was there anything to support this idea that we can, peek into the future with remote viewing?
The findings weren't as strong as those for present-time remote viewing, but they were definitely intriguing enough to warrant more investigation. It's almost as if we're picking up these faint whispers from the future, but we need a more powerful receiver, so to speak, to really tune in.
Wow. So we've got remote viewing in the present, which is already pushing the limits of what we thought we knew, and now we're layering on this potential ability to tap into the past and future. That's a lot to process.
It really is, and it highlights how important it is to approach this whole field with a healthy balance of, open-mindedness and skepticism. We need to be willing to entertain some pretty wild ideas, but we also need to be rigorous in our research to make sure we're not just chasing shadows.
Which brings us to something this meta-analysis really drove home. We desperately need more rigorous and standardized research methods in the field of remote viewing.
Absolutely. If we want to move beyond these intriguing anecdotes and really understand what's going on with remote viewing, we need solid, replicable data. And that means addressing some of the methodological challenges that have, dogged this field for decades.
Like what? What are some of the biggest hurdles researchers face when they try to study something as slippery as remote viewing?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is subjectivity. We're dealing with internal personal experiences, and those are incredibly difficult to standardize or measure objectively.
Right. How do you measure a feeling or a sense of knowing in a way that's consistent and reliable across different people? It sounds as if there's some kind of remote viewing center in the brain that we can just, stick someone in an fMRI machine and watch light up.
Not yet, anyway. And that's where the need for some really creative research designs and innovative approaches comes in. We need to find ways to study these subtle experiences in a way that's, both scientifically sound and respectful of the subjective nature of what we're trying to measure.
It's like trying to bottle lightning, isn't it? You need the right tools and techniques to capture something that's both powerful and fleeting.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of replicability, or rather the lack thereof. Historically, it's been really tough to get consistent results with remote viewing experiments, which has, understandably, fueled a lot of skepticism from the broader scientific community.
I get that. If you can't reliably reproduce results, it's hard to build a strong case that something real is going on.
Precisely. And that's one of the reasons this meta-analysis was so valuable. It tried to take a broader view to see if there were any consistent trends or patterns across a large number of studies. And as we've discussed, it did find some statistically significant effects.
But even with a meta-analysis, like you mentioned earlier, we have to be very careful about potential biases. Differences in how the studies were conducted, and the fact that not all studies are created equal. Some are going to be more rigorous than others.
Absolutely. It's a constant process of improvement and refinement. We need to learn from past research, identify any flaws or limitations, and design better, more rigorous studies moving forward.
And part of that means being aware of the experimenter effect, right? That's where the researcher's own beliefs or expectations can unintentionally influence the results of a study.
Exactly. If a researcher is absolutely convinced that remote viewing is real and they're hoping for positive results, that can subconsciously affect how they interact with the participants, how they analyze the data. It can creep in everywhere.
It's a good reminder that scientists are human too. And we all have our biases, even when we're trying our best to be objective.
Couldn't agree more. That's why it's so important to have open communication in the scientific community, peer review, and replication of findings by independent researchers. It's the only way to make sure we're building knowledge that's as solid as possible.
It sounds like the study of remote viewing, and maybe all of parapsychology, is like navigating a minefield of potential biases and pitfalls.
In some ways, it is, but that's true of any scientific field that's still in its early stages. It's all part of the process of moving from pure speculation to a deeper understanding, from those captivating anecdotes to a body of rock-solid evidence.
So despite all those challenges, it sounds like you're optimistic about the future of remote viewing research.
I am. I'm really excited by the growing number of researchers who are willing to take a fresh look at remote viewing and come up with innovative new ways to study it, because, let's face it, if there's even a tiny chance that we can tap into these extraordinary abilities, it's a chance worth taking.
Absolutely. It could completely change how we understand consciousness, perception, the nature of reality itself.
And who knows what other amazing discoveries might be waiting for us along the way.
It's like we're standing on the edge of something huge, a whole new frontier of human potential waiting to be explored.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note of excitement and possibility, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive for today. A huge thank you to our amazing expert for guiding us through this incredibly fascinating, often baffling, but always thought-provoking world of remote viewing. And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for coming along for the ride. Until next time, keep those minds open and stay curious.